Hey everybody, Syntax77 here, and today I want to do a little crash course on hammock camping. From the basics, whether you're brand new and just starting to do your research, or perhaps you got your first kit but you're not quite sure what to do with everything so far, all the way up through maybe some more advanced applications for those of you out there who already are into hammock camping. Maybe it'll be fun just to get a different perspective on somebody else's system or systems. This is the first gear video I've done in a while. I've pretty much retired from that and have been doing just my trip videos, but I was inspired to do this one because I was thinking, I'm back on the East Coast now. I was out west doing a bunch of tent camping. I'm getting ready to get back out with my hammock, and it occurred to me, it was way back in 2012 in the Catskills of New York that I invested in my first hammock camping system, and I took it out that month. And for the last 13 years, it's been a hobby and a passion of mine, and I've had a lot of different scenarios that I've used them in, so I thought that I would share that with you today. So in my backpack here, I got my entire hammock camping system, and we'll get into what all that is. I'm thinking my idea is, for the basics, I will show you what's in the pack to see how everything looks packed down. Then we'll find some suitable trees, I'll set it up, and I'll just go through all the different components. I'm just using my one go-to system to keep things simple, but I will pull back on those 13 years of videos. I've filmed all my hammock camping trips, so we'll overlay some of that in so that when I talk about these different systems and options, you can see what it kind of looks like as well. So first things first, let's open up the pack and show you what I got inside. There is my pack. Now, your backpack will probably be more of a traditional looking backpack. I understand that, but this is just big enough for what I have today. Interestingly though, just for the challenge, I did actually years ago do a 3-day trip using just this pack. So that was kind of fun, but here we go. So open this guy up. There are 4 components we got going on for hammock camping in general, depending on how you look at it, but I'm going to call it 4 components that you'll need to get started. First and most important, well, they're all important, but the most obvious, the hammock body itself. In my case, it's right here. It's a little Dutchware 10-ounce hammock. I will point out, this is my go-to system that I've developed over the years. It is very minimal, so I don't want to scare people away. When you see it set up, there's some quirks to it that might look a little odd to you, but it's going to be a good base to show you just the simplicity of a hammock system. So that's my hammock body right there. Next up, you're going to need some sort of suspension. That's going to keep you attached to the tree and off the ground. In my case, I've got some Dutchware spiderweb straps, and we'll see that more when it's on the tree. Now, I said 4 components. Some of you out there may already have a hammock, or have realized there are hammocks that come with the suspension built in, already integrated. In that case, you don't have to worry about this. That choice has been made for you, but I'll get into the reasons for the benefits of a separate system as we go. But there we go, hammock and suspension. Next up is going to be insulation. You're going to need to stay warm, right? So for hammocks, and there are other options, but I go with quilts nowadays, all quilts. You have your underquilt, and that is this guy right here that goes underneath of you, and your top quilt that goes over top of you. And last but not least, 4th component is something to keep rain and wind off of you, most likely a tarp, right? So this is my tarp right here. It looks a little weird, the stuff sack it is in are snakeskins, but I just for me, when I'm in my regular backpack, this actually crams down really small, only weighs like 5 ounces. I cram it in the outer mesh pocket of my pack, and it's pretty easy. So those are the 4 components, but you probably want to see them on a tree. So that brings me to the next thing, which is tree selection. So throw this stuff back in here. Let me walk around and find myself some suitable trees. I went ahead and set everything up, and there it is right there, this particular system. Now, if you're at all familiar with hammocks, you've been looking at pictures and whatnot, you may already realize something a little different here. First off, my underquilt is 3/4 length. not standard. We'll get into that when I get to insulation. And the Bugnet is only partial, super not standard. I happen to like this. We'll get into that when we get into the hammock bodies, but typically you would have a Bugnet running the length of the entire hammock with a zipper.
Well then zipper me up, sir. This doesn't look natural.
Yes. Those are the two things that probably stand out if you're wondering why it looks like that. Suspension, I'm going to start with that first. So down here at the end, I got my hammock straps. You're going to need some sort of suspension. Most likely, it's going to be some sort of synthetic strap like this. I'm going to say most likely. There are more minimalist systems. I'm not going to go that deep on this video, but there are systems that use all rope, like something called a Whoopie hook. Super light and small, but even with that, you want to protect the tree bark. So even with one of those systems, you would still have at least a couple feet of webbing, sometimes thicker, called a tree hugger, and that protects the tree so you're not tearing up the bark, and when you leave, everything looks like it did before you got there. Nice and clean, leave no trace, right? So let's get to how these straps connect to the hammock. In my case, I have separate straps, as mentioned before, and I just have a loop of something called am steel that is very strong, that is permanently through the hammock body, and then that allows me to choose different suspension systems depending on the trip, whether that be longer straps or shorter straps. Maybe I do want to use that Whoopie hook system because I'm trying to go super lightweight. When you have a system that is detachable like this, that gives you the ability to very quickly, right before your trip, switch it out without messing with the actual hammock body and everything, which can be a pain. Another advantage of quick detachables, if your straps are wet or dirty, you can very easily store them separate from your hammock body. Keeps it nice and clean and dry. Personally, I like to stuff mine on the outside mesh pocket of my pack and keep it in there while I'm hiking till the next site. Yours may have come with the system already integrated, and that's fine. You also may notice this looks a little strange to you, possibly, right? This is called a beetle buckle. It's made by Dutch Wear Gear, same people to make these straps, which are like a Poly Pro blend, these particular ones. But this suspension system here, as you can see, is super minimal, and it kind of slides back and forth on there. I'm not going to get into the specifics of how it's used, but that's the system I have on there now. Most likely, you've seen something else that is way more common and maybe included on some of the systems you're looking at, and that is called a cinch buckle. It's real simple. I used one in the past for many years as well, and they will basically achieve the same thing. Now in this case, my hardware slides back and forth on the strap. For a cinch buckle, you just pull the strap through it. It's really simple and easy. They have aluminum ones that are nice and affordable, and they also have titanium ones as well that would cost a little more. They're a no-brainer, and they're lightweight, and they're easy. As far as the strap goes, yours may have come with, or the one you're looking at may have like more of a black seatbelt looking material. That would be just a standard nylon strap. That's going to be a lot less costly and might get your foot in the door a little quicker. That might be like 10 bucks for a pair of those versus something like this, a little fancier and lighter. That would be like 40 bucks. But these have a 1,500 pound weight rating. Your nylon ones are probably going to be similar as well. They just might weigh a little bit more. And you're just going to pick your length of strap. That's another choice to make. In my case right here, I got 15 foot. That's on the high end. The low end would be 10. That's probably cutting it to the shortest you'd want to do. And the sweet spot seems to be a lot of people like the 12 foot straps. Now, if you're like me when I started off at first, you might be thinking the whole reason for selecting strap length is going to be your distance between trees. And yes, that is a factor, but what you may not be thinking of right away that is probably more important to strap length is going to be the size of the tree you're hanging from. The bigger your tree, the more strap it's going to eat up, right? Like, I wouldn't hang from that little guy, but you can imagine he's only going to use a couple inches of strap. If I was out in the Pacific Northwest with some of those big beastly trees, it could be the trees out to here. I'm going to eat up a significant portion of my strap just wrapping around the tree. So that is why you would go for longer straps. In my case, I went overkill. 15 foot pretty much gets me through any scenario I'm going to be in. And they're very lightweight for their strength, only about 6 ounces maybe for both of them, so around 3 ounces a piece. And then the way they are connected to the tree, I will show you that right here. I kept it simple for the video and simple for myself. These are just climbing carabiners. You can see this is 1,100 pounds rated, and that just makes it really easy to go around the tree and connect. It is possible to skip this, and you could see how there's that little loop in there. You could run the strap through itself and do away with the need for this hardware at all. The downside to that is, in my case here, it didn't matter. No branches, right? But let's go over here and take a look. Kind of a scenario, but let's say this is covered with branches and you want to adjust up or down. If you've done the through the strap method, it's going to be a real pain because you're going to take everything apart and back through itself to do that. If you have a clipping system like this, I can unclip, go over or under a branch and reclip. It's just a convenience thing, but it can really speed things up. I would say if you're new, it would be worth it to at least go with a simple carabiner just to save yourself the headache when you're out there doing this for the first time. And there are fancier ultralight versions as well. There's something called Dutch clips. It's a little titanium piece of hardware. Say this weighs 1.25 ounces. Those things weigh a matter of grams and they just clip on there, but that's kind of going down a different rabbit hole. Another suspension worth mentioning is something called daisy chain webbing. It's basically 2 layers of straps sewn together at 3-inch intervals to make a series of loops. This is actually the first upgrade I ever did to my original Hennessy hammock. About 2 years into hammock camping, I got this along with some climbing carabiners, and the OG of this is the Python straps. They worked really well. I would say they're good for beginners because they're dead simple. You just clip in at your desired interval and go. Now, the downside to this that bothers a lot of people is adjustability. On a cinch buckle system or something similar, you can really fine tune it. On these, you're going to have to go in increments of 3 inches to make your adjustments. So, you know, personal preference thing, but for beginners, I would say not bad. They are super simple. Now, when I bought my original Python straps, it used to be another downside that people will point out is that they weigh more because obviously you have 2 layers of straps. But with today's modern materials, I actually checked the other day, and you can get a pair of 12-foot daisy straps for under 5 ounces. So might actually be worth me looking into again as well. They're pretty cool. Either way, you just want some way to wrap around the tree and connect it. And you see how I'm running off the back there so that I'm not putting a lot of stress on this. If this carabiner was over here, I don't want like a bend in the strap, because anytime you add bends, you're going to add tension and those weight ratings will degrade. Speaking of weight ratings and degrading and safety and your gear surviving, there's another thing with hammocks that is called the hang angle. Basically, that is the angle that this strap comes down to the hammock body. Now, right now, I just have a backpack in here for weight. When you load the hammock, it's going to change a little bit. But the general rule of thumb is usually 30 degrees. That's the magic number. And if you're wondering how on earth you're going to figure out 30 degrees, real quick and dirty way, just take your thumb and your forefinger, that right there between those 2 points, just line that up with your strap, and you're good to go. 30-degree angle when the hammock is loaded. And basically when you do that, it's going to do a couple different things. First of all, for your weight ratings and strength of your fabrics and straps and all that, when you're at 30 degrees, that is pretty much the neutral spot where, say, a strap is 1,500 pounds weight rated, it's still right there. The more you get a steeper angle or a flatter angle, the more you're going to multiply the force, and things can potentially break or fail. The number one thing I would say that a beginner might do is go ahead and pull this thing so tight that it's like flat. It's even hard for me to do now because it's got weight in it. But let's say you just pulled it as tight as possible and it's perfectly flat. So now instead of 30 degrees, you have close to like 180. That's going to multiply the force of everything a lot. All this stuff is super high weight rated, but you want to be careful with it. On top of that, though, is also kind of accepted out there as the best angle to get a nice comfortable lay. Just being comfortable in the hammock. So that's important too. I will say this though, you see this line here running across here? Not all hammocks have it. You can certainly run without it. But the purpose of this is, it's called a structural ridgeline. And I won't go too deep on it, but basically there's a formula for the length of your hammock. And if you get this pre-installed, you won't have to worry about this, but it's about 83% of your hammock length. If you have a line like this basically forces the hammock so that when you pull it, it's kind of it makes it a no-brainer to get a good, comfortable lay. It's gonna not allow you to hang it basically at an incorrect angle for the most part, unless you went really close together. And then you would notice that there's a lot of slack in the line, which I actually have a decent amount of slack, but when I'm sitting in it, this gets to about a guitar kind of string that I can barely bend kind of stiffness. So that is pretty convenient. And if you have the structural ridgeline, which I would highly recommend for a camping hammock, it makes everything easier. If you have that, then it'll be a lot more forgiving when you're throwing your hammock up, because you know that if you get that, slack out of the ridgeline, you got yourself a good hang. All right, so that is the suspension system. I didn't mention how I chose the trees. It's pretty straightforward, but basically it goes like this, right? You want a decent, sturdy tree. That's obvious. You want to check that it's not dead, which I have unfortunately made some mistakes in the middle of the night, woken up and been on some questionable trees. It pains me to admit this, but I probably should. You want to see an example of how not to set up a hammock as far as tree selection goes? My only excuse, I'll go ahead and make one, is that I was totally over it, I guess, by the time I slugged in here from my night hike yesterday, but it's really no excuse. Check this out. Yeah, I probably should have paid attention. Look at that tree. That's not great. It's completely rotted out inside. The thing just feels not healthy. Not what you want to hang your weight from in a hammock. You don't want to do that. And the distance. Generally, I would say, general rule of thumb, 15 to 20 feet is a kind of a sweet spot for distance between trees, and that'll make it easy to get a nice angle and give you plenty of room to work with. A simple way for that is paces. It would be about 5 or 6 paces for that distance range. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm at the kind of top end of that range, but it's looking good. Another thing I'll point out on tree distance, some of you might be wondering, what if I want to go further apart than 20 feet? Well, you can totally go for it. Get wild, have fun. I've certainly done it plenty of times before. You can see in this footage here, my trees are actually like 30 feet apart. But here's what to keep in mind. The further apart your trees are, the higher on the tree you're going to have to go to get that nice angle for comfort, as well as keeping your butt off the ground. So at a certain point, unless you got a step ladder, things are they're going to get a little dicey. And other than that, you just want to check around for other trees that might be dead. Like, yeah, he's partially questionable right there, right? But you wouldn't want a big widowmaker over top of you or anything like that. All right, so that is suspension systems. Next up, let's talk about the tarp. So my tarp right there, this is a fancy guy. Some of you may have recognized this that are a little more familiar in your research. This was previously called Cuben fiber. Now it's called Dyneema. It's basically from the sail industry for sailing boats. It is super lightweight and still very good strength, hence why it's used for sails. But they are expensive for that weight savings. Now this whole system here, tarp rather, the tarp itself is only 5 ounces. Pretty crazy. Very light, but also very expensive. Nowadays, I would say maybe $350-ish for a tarp like this. I know, sticker shock. Now I will say this thing is over a decade old, and it's pretty much just like the day I bought it. I love the thing, and I continue to use it till this day. Now it did take me a couple years to make that decision to jump in, and you might be in the same boat. So in that case, there are other options out there for sure that would be about 1/3 of the cost of this and still high end, but they will be 2.5 to 3 times as much weight. But still, while this is 5 ounces, maybe you could get one more affordable. It'd be like closer to £1, and that would be tarps made out of nylon or polyester based fabrics, maybe a blend of the two, something like that. I would still recommend going for a decent vendor. It will cost you about $100 for a tarp like that, but they're gonna, you know, if you get one suited for hammock camping, it's gonna have the proper dimensions and whatnot. Speaking of that though, you could totally replace this with any old tarp you want, as long as it gives you coverage. You can get a cheap trucker tarp from Walmart, go for it. As far as the size goes, I would say the minimum you wanna do, rule of thumb seems to be 11 foot by 8 foot width at a minimum. If you have an 11-foot hammock, I believe it comes out to roughly 9 feet long when properly hung. That gives you 2 feet of space to work with. In my case here, I went a little bit overkill, and my tarp is 12 feet long. That's just to give me a little extra working room when it's raining and I'm crouched under there trying to cook. It also gives me ability to go up even bigger size in hammocks. Right now I have it pitched backwards, as you can see. That's just so you can see what's going on. This one's made by Hammock Gear. It's called their Hex Tarp. I love it. I just have it flipped back and clipped to itself. And you can see my system for this is a little bit fancy. If you're comfortable with knots and you don't mind the extra time, you can just get some line and tie out your tarp however you want. Now with Cuben fiber or Dyneema, this guy here, virtually no stretch. And that's why a lot of times guys will run it like I do with some shock cord, so that as it gets hit with a burst of wind, it's got some play. And also it makes it really simple for me to set this up because I don't have to get the tension on this exactly right. It's going to take up the slack. Pretty nice. You can also see, now that I have it flipped back, I have something called side pullouts. Not super necessary, but these I find are nice to put a little more headroom inside. It's just, it gives a place for a line to come off and pull back off the hammock body. And you can see, I didn't pull this one out super far, but the tighter it gets, just the more headroom is in there. You can also get fancy and pull it up to a tree branch or something and really get some extra height depending on how you're setting up. So we'll clip that back on there like so. You're obviously also going to need some way to attach your tarp to the tree, and that's where you can get simple or fancy as well. Now, if you want it to be simple or just cost effective, just get some line and run it out. If you're good with knots, just do your thing, or use any type of little hardware hack that you have like I do. And you know, you can get the tension right on each end because you would have a line coming directly from here to the tree. That's the kind of traditional setup. You notice on mine now, I got this line running across the top. And if you're wondering what that's about, it's called a continuous ridgeline. This is a little more of a, I wouldn't call it a learning curve, but it's something else to think about. But the nice thing about this is I put this line up first and I tension it at the other end. You can either do that with knots or hardware. In my case, I use some hardware called a Dutch wasp, but hey, that's because I'm lazy and I like titanium stuff. Either way, once you get this line up back and forth, you don't have to worry about centering anything, right? Then you have these little sliders here. If I can expose it for you. Okay. It's basically a prusik. It's just another little loop of rope, and it's a prusik. So when there's pressure on this, it doesn't move. But when there isn't pressure, I can freely slide it back and forth. And you can also, if you're really a gram weenie, you don't even need this carabiner. There's a way to attach this without it, but again, I'm lazy. The important part to note is, though, that now I can slide my tarp back and forth, and it makes it so much quicker and easier to get it centered the way I want over top of the hammock. I would highly recommend that. It's called a continuous ridgeline. It's very cool, I think, and just makes things easier than going back and forth with individual lines coming off the end. If you're wondering what's balled up at the end here, that is those snakeskins that you saw before, that snake tubular looking stuff sack. Kind of a fancy thing, but the cool thing about that is you can leave those snakeskins up. It keeps the tarp nice and out of the way. I do that in situations where I'm not expecting rain, but I want something that's quickly deployable, I can keep that up there. If I never need it, great. I can easily throw it back in my pack the next morning. But if I do, I can quickly whip it out and stake it to the ground super fast and easy. That's your tarp. You can go super deep with research on those, believe me. But the gist of it is, get 8.5 or an 8-foot by 11-foot tarp, and you can get started without dropping a lot of coin. And tent spikes, obviously. In my case, I'm actually using some sticks, but that's all there is to that. And my hardware is this little worm guy that I'm clipped to that I can adjust without knots. So that covers tarps, at least for the basics. The second half of this video, I'll get into some maybe more exotic setups for all this stuff. But that's that. So got those two down. Now we're on to the hammock itself. In my case, this is called a Dutchware half-wit hammock. And it's been my go-to for the last like 6 years or so. It's 10.5 feet long. Generally, hammocks are going to be 11 or 10 foot long. This is kind of a sweet spot right in between, and I do enjoy that. There are some budget hammocks out there that are like 9 foot. I think that's starting to go away, but years ago, there was a lot of cheap 9-foot hammocks out there. I would avoid that. I don't think regardless of your height, it's just getting a comfortable lay. 9 foot's pushing it a little bit, but just my personal opinion. Either way, you pick a hammock body to match with your suspension. There are very cheap Amazon options out there, and go for it and try them out. They're probably not going to come with that Ridgeline I talked about, and the materials might be a little heavier and less comfortable, but you can get it done. I will say this right here, probably $100 for this very minimal hammock body. And in my case, the reason it's called a half-wit is because I just have this adjustable bug net here that covers my top half, and it drapes down on me. It saves me weight. There's no zippers or anything. That's a little extreme. You're probably going to go with a system that has a zippered bug net. You just zip in and out of that, and you're good to go. And some have double zippers, some have single zippers. Those are things to look into depending on your preferences. There's also modular hammock camping systems out there. An example of that would be, I have one as well, the Dutchware Chameleon hammock, where you buy the body and then he has a whole bunch of different accessories that zip on and off. So you might have, for certain seasons, a bug net system that covers the whole thing. You zip that on, and then maybe in the winter you switch to a solid top cover to retain some heat and keep the wind off of you. And then you can get little sidecar pockets on the side, and you can go crazy with it. That's getting a little advanced for this video, but those options are out there and they're pretty cool. And that gives you the ability to have one hammock system where you can tailor it for each trip. So if you know you're going to continue to hammock camp, I would say maybe invest in a system like that. If not, maybe go something more budget, or just buy the hammock body and don't go crazy with all the accessories. Just start with that. There are different fabric options. Poly-based fabrics are going to have less stretch, and nylon's going to have more. In the case of this, it's called Hexon. I'm not sure exactly what the blend is, but it kind of feels like cotton a little bit, but it still has a little bit of stretch for comfort. I like that. That's a personal preference. You're either just going to have to bite the bullet and guess, that you want firm or stretchy, or try out some ones that maybe a friend has or something like that. Another thing I will say real quick about fabric choices is this is a super lightweight. It's called a 1.0. Hexon. They go up to a 1.6, I believe, just without getting into the nitty gritty. It's just the thickness and of the fabric and the weave and everything. The lighter weight hammocks are going to have lower weight ratings. This one is, this whole hammock body is only 10 ounces, and it has a weight rating up to around 200 pounds, I believe. And, the heavier fabric, the more weight rating. So keep that in mind when you're buying it. And then there's also little modifications and stuff. I don't really use these, but these little cords I could pull out to give some shape to the hammock and keep it from blowing around, or just give it some shape. Down here, you also notice this is my stuff sack for the hammock. It's called a double-ended stuff sack. Just another little fancier thing, not super necessary. If your hammock's in a regular sack, that's fine. But the cool thing about these is they open at both ends. So when I go to pack up in the morning, I pull this down like this, I disconnect the other end, and then I just walk the hammock body up stuff it into this as I go, cinch it back down, hammock never touches the ground, throw that in my pack, I'm good to go. So that's the double-ended stuff sack. There's something called a Knotty mod that I have on here that makes a little foot box, and it stretches so that my feet, depending on which way I lay, I'm comfortable. Most hammocks you can lay in either way you want, but do keep in mind there's something called asymmetrical hammocks where you choose to lay head to the right or head to the left. There's no actual shape to this gathered end style of hammock here. So it doesn't matter which way you lay. Go ahead and lay there, Sarah. I know it's tough work. You see how she naturally just went to an angle? That's because if you want to get flat in a hammock, you lay at an angle. People have preferences. Some like their head to the left and their feet to the right. Some like the opposite. Again, that's one of those things that you might not know that preference until you start using them. So I would say maybe go with a symmetrical system where that doesn't matter and you can figure that out yourself. But there are some hammocks where you really want to do weight savings and you can choose that lay angle, and then they're going to tailor the bugnet and everything to save fabric to that lay angle, but you are going to be stuck with that, you know, sleeping head to the left or right. Personal preference, something to look out for and think of. That's only going to be on your higher end hammocks. All right, so last component is going to be warmth, insulation, right? When I first started hammock camping, I invested in a Hennessy hammock, the OG of camping hammocks. They really really sparked a lot of innovation. And this was back in 2012. They were quite popular and I got one and I really liked it. But it also cost a pretty penny, basically. I was not trying to spend a lot of money back then. So I went in and invested in the hammock system itself. And that particular hammock, it was nice. It came as a kit with suspension and tarp and everything right there. So all I had to worry about was insulation, and I didn't want to pay for all these expensive quilts. So I'll tell you right now, if that's you, you can totally get by on doing what I did, which was, because I was already tent camping, I used a sleeping bag as my top quilt. And that's no problem. You can do that. It's going to be a little bit overkill because what I'm using nowadays is called a hammock quilt. And it basically is meant to drape over top of you. It can cinch around your neck. And then it has a little foot box at the bottom that starts, you know, about that far up on it. In my case, you can see I got this cinch here and there are buttons. That's because I like the ability to unbutton this and uncinch it, and it just turns into one rectangular like throw. So I can sit around at camp and just use it as a throw blanket, or in warmer temperatures, I can adjust this opening here and it actually lets my feet breathe a little bit. Or if it's really warm, I can just completely undo it and it's like a blanket. If you don't want to worry about that, or you're dealing with colder temperatures, you can get what's called a sewn foot box, and that'll just be sewn shut. You'll never have the ability to open it, at least not at the very bottom there, but it will be less prone to drafts and whatnot. You can easily do that by flipping a sleeping bag upside down. Here's the problem with that though, and what I discovered back then. You're still going to be cold, because the way a sleeping bag works is that down lofts up and it traps all these little layers of air. Well, for the same reason that you need a sleeping pad when you're sleeping in a tent, the side you're laying on is compressed. That's not doing anything for you, that down. So it's going to be basically just like laying in the hammock with no insulation underneath of you. Unless it is super warm conditions, even in what I would call warm climates, you're still going to get cold probably over the course of the night. So you're going to want some sort of insulation underneath of you. There's really no getting around it. Some people say they don't use it in like hot summer months. That's fine. Figure out what works for you, but I'm not going to recommend that. Get something underneath of you. So what I did was I just took a pad, and this is totally possible. People do this. I took my foam sleeping pad and I put it right in the hammock body of my Hennessy hammock back in the day. And it's a little cumbersome. You got to get it right, but you lay on it and I stayed warm. with the pad actually in the hammock. So that is a budget way to get started with hammock camping. Just keep in mind, and it's not going to be as comfy, and it's not going to be necessarily that hammock experience that you might be expecting, because you're going to have this rectangle in there with you, and you got to make sure it stays put and all that. But it is possible. Eventually, I went ahead and sprung for my first underquilt, and that was a full length version. So this is 3/4 length. We'll get back to that in a second, but normally it's going to be about this much longer. It's going to cover your entire body, head to toe, and it's like it's half a sleeping bag. It goes underneath, and just like mine, even though it's shorter, it attaches with some shock cord, and you can adjust that. You can have a friend help you. You can lay in there and they can tell you when it looks good for when you're first starting. But you just adjust those to get it nice, and then to get that sealed up, because you don't want air going in there, they have little points on the side where you can cinch that up. And obviously when you load it with weight, it's going to change. So just because it looks good when nobody's in it doesn't mean it's going to feel good when you're in it. But with some playing around, you get these things dialed in, and they're awesome. Now that one is minimal. That only goes from about shoulder to calf. And it's a 40-degree model. I use it for anything 40 degrees and up. It cuts the weight down a lot. This thing's down, and it's only 14 ounces. But for these systems, they will recommend, to keep your feet warm, you put a little foam sit pad that you might be carrying anyway underneath your feet. In my case, honestly, I don't see many people say this, but maybe it's just me. I almost never do that because I'm in more fair climates. I've forgotten to use my little sit pad underneath my feet so many times that I realize I don't need it anymore. I just wear some decent socks and I'm fine. And that's what works for me. But if you're just starting out, that might be a little jumping into the deep end of the pool to find out if you want something as minimal as this. Maybe go with a full length underquilt. There's vendors like Hammock Gear out there. God, that's really the bulk of what I bought. So there's a lot of brands out there. Just Google underquilts, and they're all the same, pretty much similar idea. Just like the hammock body, though, I will tell you, some of them are going to be tailored for that left or right lay. Mine are not. My Hammock Gears are symmetrical, so they just cover a rectangular shape underneath of it. You can see it's tapered from, there's a head end, it's a little thicker and it tapers down, but I can lay with my feet either way and it doesn't matter. So watch out for that. And also, if you do want a budget-friendly version, they have synthetic versions of these as well. They're going to be a lot less than the down, okay? But there you go. That's that as far as the insulation goes. All right, now that we've covered the basics and the basic components, for those of you still with me, if you'd like to come along for the ride, let's get into some more advanced use cases, scenarios, etc., weather, and things like that. So first things first, let's say that it's not fair weather and you're going into some colder situations. You're most likely going to be doing this after you've been hammock camping for a little bit, I'm assuming, but either way, what are some things to think about? Well, you're going to need a heavier grade underquilt, right? That's the first thing. So I got a 40 degree here. You could go up to, I mean, I have a 0 degree that is full length and it is super fluffy. It's huge. Forget how many ounces it is, probably, you know, easily 20 something, if not pushing up in the high 20s, but it is super warm. It's also expensive because the more down, the more expensive it is. And it's another quilt to buy because you don't want to carry that all the time. The other option is stacking underquilts. Now, you're still going to have to either borrow or buy a second underquilt, but you could, keep in mind, you can get 2 fair weather underquilts and you can stack them and it's going to get the job done. You can easily use that as a little trick to get down into lower temps. That's going to be a decision that you make, though, is do you go all in and buy a second underquilt that is just super hardcore, but you only use it in that whatever for you is the lowest temperature possibility? Or there is also the possibility of not investing in that mega 0 degree quilt or whatever it may be that you only use like once a year. You could get another underquilt but slightly different temp range or, you know, design or something like that, that you have more of a use for both of those quilts. But then every once in a while you can combine the two and you can get away with like sub-zero temps or something like that. I've got the 0. I've never doubled that since I've gotten it, and I have taken it down below 0 before, and I've been okay. You're never really going to, other than doubling, find a way to kind of cheaply find a hack for getting your bottom insulation better. I guess you could also throw a pad in there. It's getting a little crazy, but you could. But for the top, it's super simple, and I've done this. Just bring like a fleece throw blanket or something if you're trying to be budget conscious like I was. And I have done that. I've packed in an extra blanket. You just want to make sure that you put that down over you first, and then your down top quilt, because you don't want to compress that down. So fleece blanket or whatever, and then down quilt on top, and you can get some more winter rating. The next thing you would want to do is, well, first off, I use this hammock all the time in the winter because no bugs, so who cares about the bug net anyway? It's nice and light. But you could get a solid top cover like I was saying. They also make something called hammock socks, which looks like a big garbage bag, but it's made out of nice camping material, you know, like the hammock is. And that slides down over top and cinches around you, creates a little microclimate. And more importantly, I would say, it fully envelops you and your quilts, which keeps the wind off of you. Even the slightest breeze, that convection is going to be robbing you of heat all night. So if you can fully seal yourself up in there, you're going to be warmer. I've done that in some very cold situations. Works great. You do want to be careful of ventilation though. Maybe leave a little opening up at the top, or I've got ones that have a little mesh just strip so that some condensation can go out, because you can wake up to a bunch of frost with those systems. Wear a nice wool hat as well. I always wear at least a light hat, even in like fall, because my head is sticking out of the bag. So there you go. And then as far as tarps go for winter, you can get tarps that actually have doors on them, believe it or not. They just have 2 folding pieces down at the end that you can crisscross. And this thing looks like a big floating tent when you do that. I've got one of those in nylon, and it works really good. It's pretty cool. And if there's blowing snow or rain, it'll keep it from getting at you. Which, pro tip for rain, pitch a little higher your hammock body, because rain will, if it's bad enough, bounce off the ground, come up, and it'll start getting your hammock quilt wet. Which is why they make something called underquilt protectors as well, which looks like an underquilt, but it's just like a water resistant barrier that for a trip where you expect moisture like that, you would add that in addition. And it's like a little rain jacket for your hammock quilt. Of course, it will reduce your breathability a little bit, but there's always trade-offs, right? Another little trick I do, and it involves the tarp and that continuous Ridgeline system. Another reason I like the adjustability on that is because right now, if I have this pitched high just for the sake of the video and everything, and I'm not expecting to sleep in this or be in the rain, but if I slid both these down a little bit, slide this one in and slide that one in, all of a sudden my tarp is going to be real slack, right? But it lowers it a bit. So sometimes I do that. It looks like a real sloppy hang because I pull those in. But then I can tighten up the lines coming off, and it kind of just pulls the whole tarp down closer to the body. Because keep in mind, when you get in this hammock, it's going to get a little closer to the ground than it looks like. Now, for my beginners out there who've hung in on the video, some of you might understandably be a little confused right now and saying, what is this guy on? If he wants his tarp lower, why doesn't he just put the tarp Ridgeline lower on the tree? Well, you got to keep in mind, the tarp Ridgeline goes above your hammock suspension to keep it out of the way. And remember how we said earlier that if your trees are further apart, you have to put the straps higher. So it starts to get to a point where your tarp is just way too far up. So that is why I use this little trick to get my tarp lower. And I should also point out, this really only applies if you have a larger tarp. If your tarp is just big enough to cover your hammock, you're not really going to have that wiggle room to be able to shorten it in towards the body. But if you do, this can kind of help you out. So if you do that, you'll get more wind protection and rain protection. And also just, of course, a bigger tarp that comes down closer to the ground will achieve that as well. As far as straps go for winter, honestly, I usually go with a cinch buckle system and keep it with that. But I will say, when it comes to winter camping, remember those daisy straps that I mentioned? They're actually pretty good for winter for two reasons. A, lack of dexterity. If you're wearing gloves, fiddling around with smaller titanium hardware can be a little tricky. Also, when it comes to freezing rain, which I've definitely dealt with, as well as freeze-thaw conditions, some of that smaller hardware can be a bit of a pain when it gets frozen up. Whereas with the daisy webbing, you could be wearing gloves, even mittens, and you're going to be able to operate a carabiner just fine. So frozen conditions, that actually is a time that I would recommend possibly going to the daisy chains. Another nice thing about hammock camping, a major advantage in my opinion, is those trips where you're stuck in the rain for a multitude of reasons. First off, with a hammock system, I keep my tarp accessible all the time, and I take that guy out first things first. Let's say it starts raining right now. I can throw the tarp up first, and I've got a work area. Now I'm safe from the rain, and I can take my time and I can set up my hammock underneath. I just got to run out to the trees, of course, get a little wet during that. But that is really awesome. And the same thing in reverse for breaking camp in the rain. You can get all your stuff together, just take everything down in reverse, and the last thing to come down is your tarp. Stuff that in your pack. Hopefully you got some rain gear on or whatever, and you roll out. You didn't get any of your gear wet. There's no wet tent. There's no sleeping bag that ended up accidentally getting wet. Pretty awesome and convenient. And also, if you don't have blowing rain, let's say you're just in a kind of constant drizzle, you know, one of those situations, I love a hammock because see the way I'm pitched here right now? Well, I could leave that backside down like that. I could flip this front side up. And if I'm lucky, I got some trees around that I can run line to. And sometimes I even carry some extra line with me to do this, run it real far. I can have the tarp come straight out like a porch mode. And now I can sit in my hammock, lounge in my hammock. I'm covered, protected from the rain, but I have a nice view. And it also gives me a lot more working area because the tarp might come out to like here. I can cook underneath of it and all that good stuff. So that covers the advanced application for snow, wind, rain, stuff like that. Other weirder use cases that I won't go too deep on, but it is possible. If you're wondering, can you get two hammocks under one tarp? Yes, you can. Actually, it would be using this hardware system. You see that little hole through there? There's something called a spreader bar, and it goes, there's a little notch. You would have two of these straps coming down, and the pole would go in between them, and it would hold them the right distance apart, and you would have two hammocks side by side, and then you would just need a specific tarp that gives you coverage. Me and my wife have done that, and we're both laying right next to each other, and those bars keep us perfectly spaced out so we're not knocking into each other when we're trying to sleep and everything. Pretty cool, a little bit different. And then another weird one, there's flat lying hammocks. The only one that I own is something called the Hammock Insulation. It uses a sleeping pad. It's meant for it, and it is like a suspended sleeping pad, basically. It's pretty wild. It's a little weird when you first see it, but it's super fun. It is a heavier system, but when I'm going on a less mileage trip, I love that hammock, but I would say it's very specific, or I don't know, it depends on you, but you can check those out. And they also have a mode where you can switch it into like it's like a recliner, it's chair mode. It's kind of a niche thing, but they're super cool. And I've taken that guy down below freezing with their winter rated pad. Worked really nice. And there's no worrying about like how you're laying and your angle and all that stuff. I mean, you get an angle off the straps on the side, but other than that, you're just flat in a sleeping pad. It's pretty wild. And I've done that in rain, snow, cold. It works great. So yeah, there's some weird things out there. You can go pretty deep, but I hope this sheds some light a little bit on hammock camping basics. Hopefully some of you out there, I didn't scare you away. I was trying to, at least as we eased into these weirder subjects, I was trying to really point out that it's pretty straightforward. You just need those 4 components, and there's a lot of flexibility to do what you want to do, and you can get as fancy and as expensive or as simple and cheap as you want. There's a ton of options. I really love hammock camping, and I don't know. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you got something out of that. this, pardon me, yeah, I think that wraps it up. I'm gonna take this down. That's another advantage of hammock camping. This thing's gonna come down in a matter of minutes and get stuffed right in my pack. I'm down here in South Carolina, so it's getting close to dinner time. I think I'm gonna go back, get some dinner. So until next time, I'm Syntax77. Have fun out there.